Tailwind CSS burst onto the full stack developer scene with a fundamentally different new approach called utility first. Instead of defining classes that fully describe elements like buttons or navigation, it focuses on utilities that define styles directly, like margin, padding, colors, and borders. What seems like a counterintuitive approach at first gives you the freedom to define your layouts directly into components. What makes Tailwind CSS special is the large number of modifier and customizations that allow you to control how styles change at media query breakpoints, pseudo-elements, attribute, and even through user settings like dark mode. This makes Tailwind CSS the best way to work with CSS and module-based frameworks like React, Vue, Angular, or Svelte. If you're interested in learning it, then let's get started. Using Tailwind is a bit different than other tools. It needs to analyze your HTML and JavaScript files, and then it will generate some CSS based on what it finds. And for that reason, it means that unlike tools like Bootstrap, where you can simply refer to a script tag, it requires a build process. So let's take a look at some of the options. The most straightforward is to use the command line interface. Now, this will automatically take care of looking at your HTML or JavaScript files and then creating a CSS file based on those for you. Now, this is not going to provide a lot of infrastructure for development though, so you won't get things like a live preview and proper build processes. You can also install it as a post CSS plugin. This takes a little bit more work, but it gets along better with build tools like Vite or Webpack. Now, although this is a pretty good setup, it still doesn't give you a complete set of tools. If you're using a framework, things get a little more complicated. Thankfully, there's a set of detailed guides available for you on the website. So you can see guides for all the major frameworks. Thankfully, there's a set of detailed guides for a lot of different frameworks. These are excellent, but you're probably going to want to tweak things a little bit. We'll work on an example in one of the later videos. Now, if you want to, you can also play around with a CDN. Because the CDN runs some JavaScript to look at your page code every time it loads, this isn't something that you'll want to do in production, but it's an easy way to try out the features. I'll also show you how to do this on something you can host on GitHub. Let's take a look at some of the other tools that you're going to want and some optional things that you're probably going to want to install. First is NPM, or the Node Package Manager. In order to create projects with a build process, you need this to manage dependencies. These are like plugins that you would use to add functionality to your project. You're also going to want to install Git to keep track of this project and work with the exercises. Make sure you check out the exercise files on GitHub, as well as the exercise files video to see where you can get these files. You can also install a plugin that will help you auto-complete the Tailwind CSS classes. I'm going to recommend another plugin that's going to make your life a little bit easier when working with Tailwind CSS for web projects. Tailwind Docs will give you a quick reference of all the classes and utilities that Tailwind CSS provides directly in your editor. Finally, I'm going to use an extension for Visual Studio Code called CodeSwing that will make it easier to create examples. Since there are so many options for build tools, let's talk about what you need when you're working with this process. Tailwind CSS needs to look at the files you're creating, like your HTML and JavaScript files, analyze them, and see if there's any Tailwind CSS code in them. It then needs to generate a CSS file based on that analysis and place that somewhere in your working directory. You'll probably also want something that offers a way to process your other files. So for example, you might want something that lets you use JavaScript modules and all the other traditional things a build tool does. Finally, it's real nice to have a live preview of your changes whenever you update. So you want the ability to generate new versions of the files whenever you make a change on your site. Now for that reason, I'm going to pick Vite as an example. It's a pretty modern build tool, and it has some pretty decent instructions on the website, but I am going to modify them to show you how you can add additional things and make it a more realistic process. We'll take a look at that in the next video. There are just too many ways to install Tailwind CSS to cover them all in this course. So I'm going to go through a basic installation with the CLI using Vite. That way you can get a feel for how it works. Now to do this, we're going to need to use a terminal application. You can use the terminal from Mac OS or the terminal tool called Git Bash that you can install when you add Git to your machine. To get started, we'll run the npm init and then use the Vite command, and we'll give this thing a name. I'm going to call mine Tailwind CSS3. The first time you run this, it'll ask you if you want to install this package. Just hit return for yes, and then you can pick which kind of framework you want to use with this process. I'm going to use vanilla JavaScript, so I'll just hit return here. And for the variant of vanilla JavaScript, I'm not going to use TypeScript. I'll just use the regular vanilla JavaScript version right here. So again, I'll hit return. Now it's installed the basic project for Vite. However, we need to customize this a little bit more. First, we'll need to switch over to the Tailwind CSS3 folder we created. I'll also need to install some additional modules. Let's go ahead and clear this out. And we'll do an npm install -d. And then we'll add Tailwind CSS. We'll also add post CSS and auto prefixer. Tailwind runs as a post CSS plugin, and that's why you need post CSS. And auto prefixer adds any prefix to make Tailwind more compatible with older browsers. Let's go ahead and hit return. Now you're also going to need a couple of config files, a tailwind.config.js file, as well as a postcss.config.js file. We can have Tailwind install that for us by running the npx command and say Tailwind CSS init -p. Now we're ready to open this up with our editor. I'm going to be using Visual Studio Code. Let's open this up in Visual Studio Code. Let's take a look at what we got when we installed Vite. This isn't a complete Tailwind CSS installation just yet, but it did install the Tailwind config file as well as the postcss config file for us. There's also a package.json where you can see the different commands that we can run right here. And you can see the modules that we installed in addition to Vite, as well as Vite itself. They're installed as dep dependencies. In addition to that, we have different files here, a style.css file. This is a basic Vite file. We're not going to be using this, but we'll modify it in just a minute, as well as a main.js file. This is the entry point for Vite. And notice that it is importing that style sheet right here. It's also loading up an ID in an HTML file with some basic information right here. So if we look at the index.html file, it looks pretty normal. It does have that div with an ID of app. This is where Vite would normally place your application. Also notice that it is calling that main.js file. I'm going to go into style.css and I'll replace all this right here. And I'm going to need to call some Tailwind CSS modules. So I'll use the Tailwind command, and then I'll import base. And I'll also import components. And I'll finally import utilities. These are the three basic parts of Tailwind CSS that will import all of the pieces into your project. Let's save this and open up the Tailwind config.js file. And in here, I wanted to look in a folder called source for a file called index.html. I'm only going to be working with a basic file in this project. So that's all that I need for that. I can also ask it to look in the source folder for any folders that have any files in them with a series of extensions. So I can say, I want you to look for files with either a Vue extension, a JavaScript extension, a TypeScript extension, a JSX extension, or a TSX extension. You can customize these however you want. Now, I am going to need to create this folder. So let's go ahead and do that. And I'll hit this button right here, create the source folder. And I'm going to move this index.html file in there. Now, you could leave everything in the main folder, but I think that's pretty messy. So I like to move things into a source folder, and I'll move all the files into that directory. We don't need to do anything with the theme or the extend or these plugins. We'll run into those a lot later. Now, because we have moved things from where Vite normally expects them to be, I'm going to need to create an additional file. And this one's going to be called Vite config.js. And it's going to have an export default statement here. And I'm going to say a few different things here. So I'll say that the root folder is not going to be located in the source directory. So it's going to look for files in there. I'm going to have a public directory called public, and I'll need to create that. So the public directory is anytime you create files that you want to be directly pushed into the server when your application publishes. I'll also create the name of the output directory. I'm going to call mine docs, and this is just so that I can publish this on a website like GitHub. And then I can issue a server command and control things about the live preview server while I'm in development. So I'll say that I want it to open up a window for me whenever the server runs. So I'll save this. And now I'll need to create a public folder as well. And a lot of these projects come with a favicon file, so I'm going to move that in there. You can also put things like an image folder in this public directory if you want the images to be available on the internet. Now we're going to need to open up the HTML file in the source directory. And we're going to modify it a little bit. I'm no longer going to need the app right here. And I'm going to create a div with some basic Tailwind classes. We'll learn more about these particular classes later. But basically, I'm telling the width of the page to be no longer than 4 XL units, a little bit of padding on the different sides, and this is going to be a centered layout. Next, I'm going to do an H1, and this is going to have some classes as well. This is just going to be a font size class, so text. And notice that because I have that extension open, it's actually giving me some suggestions here. So text, and I'll use 7 XL as the size. I'll use the font bold class and text purple 900. So pretty dark purple. And then I'll say here headline. And then I'm going to create a paragraph with some lorem ipsum text. Visual Studio Code comes with a plugin called Emmet, which lets me use these shortcuts. All right, let's go ahead and save that. And let's now try running the npm run dev command. Now this should run the development server and open up a window for you, showing you something that looks like this. This is a great startup template with a really awesome build tool that I love called Vite. If you want to learn more about Vite, make sure that you check out their website. There's another way that you can play with Tailwind CSS, and that is with Tailwind Play. To get to it, you just go to play.tailwindcss.com. This is a great built-in playground where you can try any of Tailwind CSS commands. This is a zero installation playground that you can use to try or share code with others. Clearly, you lose some of the options that you have when you install your own modules or customize some of the installation, but it's a quick way to get started. You can see that it gives you a little bit of sample code here. Now you can resize this screen right here and also split it up into different versions. So you can have it full screen, just the output, or you can split screen in horizontal or vertical space. And then you can also switch to this mobile view that lets you resize this and see how your application would look in different widths. From this dropdown, you can also choose which version of Tailwind you're using. It's set to let you play with the latest versions of each of the released versions. You can also switch to a light or dark mode right here. And if you want to, you can share this and it'll create a special URL. So take a look over here. And when I hit share, it's going to create a special URL with the code that you've written. So this won't be this code that you see right here. It'll be whatever you actually paste or you play around with in here. And that means that you can share this link with other people so that they can look at your code. Now with Tailwind CSS, you generally have to configure certain things in order to get additional functionality. So notice that there is a way for you to add a config section right here. as well as this CSS version of the code, which you can control which parts of the framework are added. And you can also add additional CSS that will be added onto the page. Tailwind CSS has a special CDN or content delivery version of the framework that you can use for demos or to try features of the platform. So to get to it, you can version on the website. You can see right here that there is a Play CDN link. And all you have to do is add this link right here into your website. And then you can use any of Tailwind CSS classes. Now, the interesting thing here is that you may expect this to be a CSS file. So normally this would be a link with a relation of style sheet. And instead, though, it is just a URL, which means that this is actually a script and not a CSS file at all. So it's going to do the same thing that the build tools are going to do, which is analyze the content on the current page and then take a look at which classes you're using and then convert or create those classes using this script and give you a special style sheet that will take over the page. Now, because this dynamically creates styles based on the assessment of the code, it means that this is not something that you're going to want to use in production, but it's really good for something like a demo. So I'm going to copy this link right here. And I'm going to go to CodePen and show you how you can easily create a CodePen to play around with Tailwind CSS. So in here, I can use the JavaScript and the CSS parts if I need to. So if I wanted to customize my install, I can use a version of JavaScript here. And you can find that you can use a script a little bit different than the normal config script. And then you can customize, say, for example, here they show you the colors and how you can customize those as well. You can also add a style sheet or style attributes right here by using a style tag like this. So you could add that into your CodePen. We're just going to work with the HTML. And in here, what I want to do is go to settings, and I can load different things into my HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Remember that the Play CDN is a script. So we want to go to the JavaScript section and then paste that CDN right here. And then we'll say save and close. And I'm just going to paste some code in here that I used in the previous video so that you'll see that it will automatically show these classes just like it would in your normal file. Now, you may have noticed when this was loading that for a fraction of a second, we were able to see the HTML. And this is one of the problems with using this Play CDN, that sometimes it has to load up the JavaScript and you can see a little bit of the HTML code for just a second before it repurposes or reparses everything and creates all the styles for you. So this is great for a demo, and we'll be using this on this course so that we don't have to load up any build tools or worry about, say, the entire HTML page. I can give you quick demos, and this is great if you're doing that too, to create demos or things that you want to come back to, or if you want to play around with some of the examples that I will have created for you. I'm going to show you one more way of installing Tailwind CSS, and that is with a Visual Studio Code plugin called CodeSwing. This is a playground, much like CodePen, that allows you to try out your code, but I do like the way that it works with GitHub a lot better. It also lets you work on your local machine using Visual Studio Code, the editor that you're probably used to. So I've already got it installed in Visual Studio Code. You can always go to the extensions area right here and type in CodeSwing to get it directly installed from here. Now, to prepare myself, I've created a folder called Tailswing in the desktop. And I like to have a directory already there. So next, you want to go to the command palette, which you can get to by going to the View menu and choosing Command Palette, or using one of these commands right here. Now, there's a lot of options for working with this. The one that I like is New Swing in Directory, because it's going to allow me to version control that with Git if I want to later on. So I'll say New Swing in Directory, and then I'll find the directory that I want to place it in. So I put this on the desktop, and it's called Tailswing. And I'm going to say Open here. And now it wants you to specify a template that you want to use. I'm going to say HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. This is one of the basic templates. All right, so this is going to give you a window that's a preview on the right-hand side, as well as the CSS file and the JavaScript file right here. Now you can rearrange them by clicking on this button right here called Change Layout. And if you want to, you can use a split bottom view right here. Whichever one you want is fine. Now I need to install some additional scripts. So I'm going to pull up the command palette and I'll say CodeSwing and I'll say add library. Now here you get to choose whether or not you want to add a script or a style sheet. So if you wanted to add Bootstrap or if you wanted to add an icon library, you could do that right here. Now, because the PlayCDN is technically a script, I'm going to choose script and I have the PlayCDN right there. So I'm going to select that and I'm just going to paste the code right here from the previous video. You can see that it works exactly like the other ways, except that now this is a local file that I don't have to have an account in CodePen for, that I can run whenever I want to, and I can even version control it with Git. And also I can still customize Tailwind CSS by using the style sheets right here or the script file right here. So it is a little bit more convenient for certain types of projects. One of the first things you'll notice about Tailwind CSS is that it resets your CSS styles. If you're used to other resets, you will notice that Tailwind CSS is going to be a little more greedy about how it does things. Let's take a look. The reset in Tailwind CSS is called Preflight, and it does a lot of things. So for example, it takes care of removing all the margins in just about everything: paragraphs, headlines, block quotes, and more. Now, headings are also said to be unstyled. You'll notice this immediately, that all the text uses a sans serif font, thankfully instead of the real ugly serif fonts that browsers normally use. Also, links will not have any underlines or any color to them. Lists are also unstyled, so no margins, padding, or even a list style. So they don't even get the default bullets that you normally see when you create a list. Also, images are inline elements normally, and they are reset to block elements in Tailwind CSS. This is actually a pretty reasonable setting. Any border styles are also reset. So things don't have any borders by default on Tailwind CSS. Now this is going to be a little bit weird to look at, but I think it's the right decision for what Tailwind is trying to do, which is mainly to allow you to set some styles from scratch. So the fact that you're going to be adding those styles yourself means that it has to get rid of a lot of things that you expect HTML and CSS to do. So if you take a look at this sample right here, you may have noticed that when it first loaded, it kind of showed you what it would normally look like with regular HTML, and then it switched over to the Tailwind's layout. This is what's going to happen when you grab any document and you add Tailwind CSS to it. It just looks super plain with everything, including things like headline, not having any margins or paddings, and there's absolutely no colors, even in links. There's no borders in buttons. So notice that I have some buttons here, and so on and so forth. It's a little bit jarring, but knowing that you can make it look great by adding classes. I did add the Bootstrap icons right here, and that's why there is a class over here. And this is just bringing in these different icons that you see here. But other than that, I've removed all of the Tailwind CSS classes that you would normally add. And you've seen this content before looking pretty interesting with Tailwind CSS. Now you can, if you want to, turn this feature off. So you can turn Preflight off and get all of those styles back from the browser. And you do that by adding this into the Tailwind config file. Now, normally this is a separate JavaScript file, but when you're using something like the PlayCDN code, then you have to add it into the JavaScript section with this tailwind.config variable, and then you target core plugins, and then you set the Preflight to false. And notice that now you kind of get a few of those styles back. So you got the bullets, you got the borders around the buttons, you have links that have underlines and are blue, and the headlines have the normal stuff. So this is what you would do if you wanted to turn it off because you're doing your own reset, or you did want to keep some of these things from HTML, and then you can just add the classes on top of what it already does. But I think you'll find yourself not doing this most of the time. There's also a way to customize things if you don't want to start with this sort of super lean HTML looking document at the beginning. And the way that you do that is by where you add the CSS. And when you first start Tailwind CSS, you add these two sort of links to the different parts of Tailwind CSS. And normally you don't use this style tag right here. And so you would just have a CSS file with this stuff in it. This is just for the place CDN, and I'll show you that in a minute. Now, what you normally do is add these three. So if you want to add some additional styles, what you do is you add things into the base layer using this layer command right here. So all the Preflight stuff happens in this first import that is importing something called base, and then other things are in components and utilities. So what you do is you modify the base layer, and then you add whatever you want in here. So you could say my headline level 1 is going to apply the following Tailwind CSS styles. And so you can add whatever you want in here. So here we're adding some orange colored text with a margin top of 1 and sort of a larger font size. And then for the headline level 2, a smaller font size, indigo text, and then margin at the top of 3. So let's take a look at how that changes what we start with. And you can see it's not super dramatic. I probably should have made the headlines bold, but you can see that now at least the headlines have a little bit of difference in between them. And you can, if you want to, use this to modify your startup styles and make them whatever you want. It's a little bit easier sometimes to work with Tailwind when you don't have to go in and add the bullet points to everything or add like the boldness to the headlines and stuff like that, that you would normally assume comes with regular HTML. One more thing that I should mention is that if you are using the CDN, you're going to use this style tag and make sure that you add this type text / Tailwind CSS, or this won't work. So if you're using something like CodePen, notice that if we open up the CSS section, there's nothing in here. And that's because the CSS section doesn't have the right type attached to it. So we actually have to type this one in at the bottom of the document. It's a little bit jarring, but just remember that you have to do this if you're using the place CDN. You may be able to get away with it in other places, just in your HTML document. And if you're doing this in a normal sort of installation that has a build process, then this would just go in your CSS file that it reads. Tailwind CSS uses a technique called utility first. It allows you to design pages from a set of utilities that mirror existing CSS classes. Let's take a look at some of the advantage of the utility first approach. First, there are no unclear class names. So the framework doesn't create its own arbitrary class names that don't exactly tell you what the framework is doing. In addition to that, every class has a very clear intent. It's going to style the element a certain way. There's also no overrides because you're very explicitly defining what the element should look like. All of the CSS classes are also mirroring regular CSS styles. So it's going to be pretty familiar to you when you take a look at the code. Let's take a look at an example from the Tailwind CSS website. Here's how you would traditionally approach creating a chat notification like this. You create a container with a class of something like chat notification, and then in there you may have a section for this top part that is designed to wrap around this logo. And then you would have some classes that identify the image as the logo using something like chat notification logo like this. And then you would create another div for the other segment right here. This could be the chat notification content. And then for each of the items, you would define something like a title and a message subclass. So this creates sort of a series of classes, parent classes, subclasses, and container classes for layout. In addition to that, you would define some styles that show you how these different things actually look. And this makes it easier to change these later on. But a lot of times you end up having to override something like this whenever you want to create a slightly different style, and things can get pretty messy. With a utility first approach, you instead use something like this. you create the container, and then you don't give it a name that doesn't really tell you what the class means, but you explicitly start using class names that define what the item looks like. So for example, P6 means that you're going to have a padding of 6 units around this element. Max WSM means that the maximum width of this element is going to be a small breakpoint. MX Auto means that this will automatically center on the available container, and background white is just referring to the color of the element. Rounded XL means that you're going to have some rounded edges, and it's also telling you the size of the rounded edges. There are different sizes for the rounded edges in Tailwind CSS. And then we have shadow LG, so you can't really tell very much from this, but there is a drop shadow. If I was using sort of the light mode, you might be able to see it a little bit better. But since I'm using dark mode, it doesn't show up as well. And then you have some centering sort of classes. The flex class is the display flex class. And then item center is a way of centering things with flex. And then you can also specify the spacing in between the elements. You're saying, I want the spaces to have 4 units in between them. And this would refer to this item right here versus this item. So you're actually explicitly saying how much space you want it in between. And you can modify that by just changing that to a different unit. In addition to that, you are using some flex-based classes to make sure that this element shrinks on the left. So the image will always try to fit according to the size of the image, and it'll leave all of the extra room for the actual message, which is something that is good to do. With the logo, you're specifying the size of the logo by using an H and a W class right here. And you're saying that the size of this logo is 12 units. And then you have the rest of your image tag here. And then there's another div. It doesn't really need a name, but it's sort of just a container. And it's obvious that it is because it has no classes. And then for the font, you would say something like text XL. This would be a specific font size. And then font medium. This refers to the weight of the font. So you want a medium weight font. And then text black is the color of the font. And then the text that goes in there. And then in addition to that, you create a paragraph with a class of a color. So this is just identifying this item right here as having a sort of blue color that is of 500 strengths. And this is pretty much how all of the Tailwind's classes look like. You can go to the documentation and do a quick search in here for any of those classes. So you can say, for example, if you're looking for what the font weight classes look like, you just type it in right here and you go to the font weight and you can see the different weights and what they mean in actual CSS. Now, this is one of the things that you'll be doing all the time. So when you're creating content with Tailwind CSS, you will have this documentation running all the time because you'll be looking for what exactly these names mean when they get converted into CSS. And as you look through the different styles, you can see, for example, it has words like tracking tighter, and that means letter spacing minus 0.05 ems, and tracking wider means this. So there's always going to be a lot of looking up for the different classes. That's actually one of the disadvantages of using something like this. You are never going to learn all the class names. You are always going to have to look them up. That's why some of the extensions that I mentioned earlier are quite useful, because it's going to allow you to at least look up in the documentation where things are. And also it'll give you all the available names. So when you are typing something like tracking in Visual Studio Code, it's going to pull up all these different sizes and allow you to pick from one of them. And I think if you see them, you can kind of tell which one is the one that you need. So you just pick from the list of these different styles. And there's also a lot of different pieces of repetition in the names of things. So for example, if you look at this text decoration colors, you'll see that Tailwind CSS has this very rich color definition language. And it usually starts off with the item that you want to change the type of item. In this particular style, it's the text decoration. And then here you specify a color name and then a strength of the color. And the color strengths go from sometimes 50, then to 100, and then they go 100, 200, 300, all the way up to like 900. And there is a lot of colors in this framework. And this is because with Tailwind CSS, you have a just-in-time compiler, which means that you don't really need to worry about how many classes you have. You can also define your own version of the colors. If you want to use a color not available here, then you could just type it in yourself by using a shorthand, which I'll show you later on. But you can see that the language is super rich, and the way that you define different things uses a similar language throughout. So for example, there are also different scales. If we take a look at something like, for example, the width, right, of an element, you'll see the scale that Tailwind CSS uses. So you'll see that there's a width of 0. There's always a reset for an element. So for example, the width of 0 would be a lot of times the reset, and then there's a lot of fixed widths. So notice there is a width 96, width 80, 64, explicit sort of sizes of widths like this. And then there's also a percentage width. So you can say, I want to use a third of the page, for example, which is not something you always get with a lot of other frameworks. And then you can say this takes up a fifth, and then the second side takes 4/5. So there's a lot of fractional widths there. W full means the entire width, take up the entire width of the available space. And then there's some specialty classes like W screen, which makes something take the width of the viewport. So you'll see these same sort of size themes in different places. So if you look at min width, they'll be pretty similar sizes, or some of the similar sizes. Same thing for height. Some of the same sizes that you saw in width are in height, but sometimes you'll see that some of them are missing because some of the sizes will make more sense for widths than for height. And then when you go to something like font size, you'll see that it uses the breakpoints as the names. So it'll say things like text XS and text SM and then LG XL. So it's using the breakpoint names. I think that's a little bit confusing, but you'll see that in other places. For fonts, you get something that's more similar to their, I guess, the names that you would expect, but you see this thin, extra light, light, and that means the different numbers. Every one of the font weight numbers gets a special name. And that's why you'll never memorize all of these things, and you'll always have this Tailwind CSS guide as you are creating your content. You could see other places. Try to use any of the available CSS styles that you're familiar with. So you have, like, say, border width. Let's try that one. You can see that these are numbered widths, and you can specify the different sides for each of the elements. A border color, it's going to show you the colors here, and they're going to be very similar to other colors. So there's a lot of consistency in this framework. There's a lot of scales that are going to help you whenever you are choosing different types of things. So for example, if you're choosing widths and heights, the scales are going to be similar. And there's a lot of sort of definitions of things are named either consistently or sometimes similar to what they would be called in regular CSS. Now you do have to be careful. I do have to warn you, one thing is that occasionally you'll see different sort of styles, like these mix blend modes. They're a little bit complicated, but you have to watch out that some of the styles that you get with Tailwind CSS are not styles that are available in all browsers. So you need to make sure that you test when you work with Tailwind CSS to make sure that different browsers are able to do the things that you're trying to do, just like you would with regular CSS. So some of these features, some of the advanced features, like maybe hue rotation, I'm not sure what the usage is on most browsers, but it's a good idea to sort of go through and check your design after you've done them. But overall, the style sort of names, they make a lot of sense, and they sort of try to take the name of the property in CSS and simplify it into a name that makes sense. So you can see that the sort of divisor here is the hyphens for different value parameters. And that's just the way it works. I think overall, it's a pretty consistent design language that Tailwind CSS is trying to give you. If you want to play with this, I made a copy of that design in this CodePen right here that is on the slide. So you can play around with some of the different ways that you can modify this element. So for example, slate, I think there's a text purple, for example. And you can see that when it updates, it'll change. You can try some of the different colors here. You can try and play around with some of these classes. I really recommend that you try this Tailwind CSS framework out. It's not the kind of thing that you want to sort of just learn about. It's definitely something that is very hands-on. Tailwind is really innovative, but we need to take a look at some of the issues that you might run into when working with the framework, and also what to do about them. We've mentioned some of these before, but we're going to go over them again. First is that unlike frameworks like Bootstrap, where you simply add a link tab to a CSS file, Tailwind requires a build process. So we've already looked at the different ways that you can work around that. It also takes a lot of classes, even to do very simple designs. Now, there's a way around this that I'll show you in a minute, but it's one of the things that shocks people when they first run into the framework. When you have to use elements over and over, it's a nightmare to update all of the copies of the classes. So let's say that I was doing a bunch of buttons on a page, and then I changed something about the buttons. If I was just using the classes, I'd have to find all of the instances and update them together. So I'll do a find and replace or that kind of thing. Now, this does mean, though, that Tailwind works exceptionally well for component-based architectures like React and Vue. So if you create the components for those frameworks, this actually works to its advantage. I've also mentioned that the design system is impossible to memorize. So you'll often have to go to the Tailwind documentation and look for all the classes. That manifests itself in a few weird ways. So if you do go to the documentation and you take a look at some of the styles, you'll find that some of them are spread out around different sections. So if you're doing some buttons, you may need to look at things like, say, the outline parameter. So like the outline style, outline offset, those are structured in this border section. So even though you may use them for things like input fields or buttons, you end up having to go to this border section. So things like buttons or different things like input fields are not really in any one particular place. The individual styles for controlling those things are. And so you do end up going up and down some of this documentation a lot when using this framework. So I'll show you some ways that you can use some component-based frameworks or sub-libraries that will help you work with that. Now let's take a look at an example of how this manifests itself. So for example, I've created a sample set of buttons here, and you'll notice that I have these first two buttons right over here, and they both have very similar sets of classes. So I have some differences in the colors. So this one has a blue background and this one has a red background right here. And all these other ones are exactly the same. You can see that if I had a bunch of pages with a lot of different buttons, and I suddenly decided that my buttons should have, say, a different rounded sort of border edge. So say that I just wanted to change this from the rounded MD to just rounded, I would have to find and replace all the instances for this all over the page, which can be a little bit of a pain. One of the ways that you can work around that is by using the CSS file that you get when you create a build process and creating a set of different shortcuts for something, for example, called a button. And so you can see that this other button right here is actually just styled by adding a class of btn. And I've created that class in the CSS section by using this layer directive and then specifying that I want to add something to the components, which is one of the three things that we add right here. And then I can just use this btn class and define it as applying a bunch of other subclasses. So I've sort of put these on top of one another, but normally you would just sort of put these side by side, and they're exactly the same classes as the rest of the buttons. So I've created a default button right here, and I have told it to have all the same properties as my other buttons with a default property of gray and a hover of a slightly darker gray color. And you can see that it's very similar to the other ones. And now I have a way of going in and modifying any one of these other ones to use that same base class. So I could just say here, class btn, and then I can get rid of everything that is different here. And now this will work in exactly the same way. And I have a lot less code to write. You could also create a version of this same button that is a button red or button primary, button secondary, just like you would with something like Sass. So that's one of the ways that you get around some of these problems. There's another question that arises Since the CSS classes or the classes that Tailwind provides are very close to just using a style attribute, why would you just not use a style attribute when working with Tailwind CSS? Well, that's because one of the ways that Tailwind works is by creating a design system. I've talked about before of how when you use different classes, the scales or the numbers that you use for different properties are similar in different classes. So sometimes you'll find a specific sort of label like MD, LG, XL used throughout different places. So you're not just creating a set of styles, you're creating a design language. And that's one of the advantages, that things are going to be related by using the same sort of set of scales and this design language. One of the other reasons why you don't just use inline styles is that Tailwind CSS does give you a set of responsive utilities. So you can say, I want something to look different when somebody is at a different breakpoint. And I'll show you an example in just a minute, actually the same buttons that we just looked at. And then there's also state variants. So it means that you can do slightly different things when somebody hovers or when an element is in focus and so on and so forth. So if we take a look at the button example, again, you'll notice that these buttons normally stack, but when we get to a certain breakpoint, they'll go side by side. And that's because I'm using this responsive variant right here. So this is saying that I normally want this to use the flex column class, which will put things on top of one another. But whenever I'm at a small breakpoint, I want you to use flex row. So if we make this window bigger at a certain point, these buttons will lay out side by side. And that's what I mean by these responsive classes. We'll cover them a little bit better in the next video. I just wanted to mention that this is one way in which the Tailwind CSS classes are superior to CSS styles. And you can see that we also have some additional classes for managing state. So for example, this hover class is what lets me define something different whenever somebody rolls over the button. So that is what makes Tailwind CSS more powerful. But you do have to watch out for sort of these scary things at the beginning of when you're using the framework, because it can be challenging. I did want to show you some additional solutions that you may want to use when working with Tailwind CSS to address some of these issues that people have. So for example, there is a lot of classes that have to be added to create even simple designs. And so if you go to this Tailwind UI website, you'll see that there's a lot of pre-made sort of classes. And you can go here, for example, and take a look at how you would put together sort of a hero section. And some of these you can just click on the code and you can copy it right here to get all the classes that you would need for this sample layout. And you can even see how it adjusts with responsive design. And in other places, they do ask you to pay for this. So you do have to watch out. There is a pay structure. This is actually created by the same people that create Tailwind as a way for people to be able to support the platform. So I actually pay for this myself, and I think it's a great way to sort of support the framework. A lot of open source packages like this struggle to make money, so this is actually a great thing. There are some other ways that you can get to things like this. And so I'll show you another one. There is another one called Tailwind Kit, which is sort of a freer version of something pretty similar. So you can go here to get started, and you can find other styles in here. So in here, we need to go to, say, the components, take a look at navigation, and we can look at the sidebar navigation and go over here and copy the code as well. So just another place to go if you want to find some other sort of styles or some other components that you can just grab the code for. In addition to that, there is something called Headless UI. And this is just another set of components specifically for React and Vue. And these are pre-built components that are made for you. So you can, again, take a look at the code and just copy it. And once you install this, then you'll have access to all these different components. So for component-based architectures, Tailwind has a lot of options. There's also this Daisy UI. Now, this is a little bit different. Think of this as sort of like a bootstrap, but using Tailwind CSS components. So this is something that you would install in addition to Bootstrap. And then you have sort of a design system that is similar to what you would do in something like Bootstrap. So instead of when you look at the HTML, you would type in something like btn primary, and so on and so forth. So this is really good if you are used to Bootstrap and want to use something that is sort of very similar, but still based on Tailwind CSS with all of its different sort of additional pieces of the language. So you should still be able to, access some of the variants using this framework as well. But if you like Bootstrap, that is a great place to go. Tailwind CSS has the richest color palette of any framework I've ever seen. That's because it doesn't need to worry about publishing the CSS for everything. The just-in-time compiler saves only what you need. So there's this humongous color palette. So let's go over it. There's a number of color classes that you can use, and they're all over the place in the documentation. So for example, there is a background color class called BG, and then you specify the color and then a strength. And in the same way, the other most common one is the text color. So you do the text class and then a color and then a number for the strength. But there are lots more all over the documentation. So you're going to see all types of things like rings have colors, divides have colors, borders have colors, carets, accents, etc. But they all work pretty much in the same way. The color are defined from strength levels from 50 to 900. Let's go ahead and take a look at the example right here. You can see that the basic Tailwind colors are up here. So you can say something like BG inherit, and it'll inherit the color from its parent. Current is for certain HTML tags, and it just means that it's going to pick up the current color. And so these other colors are pretty basic. So you can use a transparent color when you want something not to have any color at all, but sort of maybe keep its shape. And then, of course, there's black and white. So you would use like BG white or text white if you wanted a white color. And then there are all of these other colors that you can use. And sometimes the differences are very subtle. So you can see that there's a color called slate. So you would say text slate or BG slate. And then there's one called gray. So pretty similar. I mean, I can hardly tell the difference, maybe around here. Notice that at 500 is usually the full strength of the color. And below 500, it's sort of like a tint. It's adding sort of white to the color. And then after 500 is sort of like the shade. It's adding a little bit of black to the color. Except when you get to like the yellow colors, I feel like the 300 and the 400 are more yellowish than the 500. I think the 500 one is possibly too dark. But you can take a look at them right here. There's slate, gray, zinc, neutral, and stone, which are all the neutral kind of colors. And then there's colors from red to orange, amber, yellow, lime, green, etc., etc. And it goes all the way to rose, which if you look at red is pretty close to red. So, there's sort of a full color wheel of colors in here. And you can even create your own custom colors if you want. But this is super rich, and most of the time you're probably not going to need to create your own colors. So that's pretty cool. There's these other classes that allow you to create gradients with Tailwind CSS. And this is a little bit weird because the class is called background image. And normally you would think that with something called background image, you would be adding an image. But this is actually how you create gradients. So basically you add the BG and you can have a background of none also here. And then you can create a gradient to a specific direction, which is one of these directions. This is top, top right, right, bottom, bottom left, etc., etc. Just like you have in CSS, you usually have those directions. And so you can read the documentation, or you can try this example because it's pretty awesome. You can create a gradient, right, from the top, right? So you say background gradient to top. So it's going to go from the bottom to the top, from red 600 down here to blue 600, right? And then I'm giving it a height, otherwise you wouldn't be able to see this. And you can see some of these other examples here. So gradient to top right. So that means that it's going to go from the bottom left to the top right. And then you just specify the colors that you choose in here. So from like red 600 to blue 600, you can use any of the color names in there. This is kind of unique because normally all of the classes in Tailwind CSS are directly matched to a specific CSS class, but there are some exceptions, and we'll be taking a look at those in a bit. Normally things like, say for example, I don't know, the flex class is tied to the display class flex, right? And then item center and justify between. These are all flexbox classes that you can use, and they have a direct sort of relative in CSS. There are some that are a little bit of shortcuts. So sometimes you see things like the height of an element, and here you specify a scale that goes in different steps. All right, there's also something pretty interesting with these gradients, and that is that you can create gradient color stops. And that allows you to create a slightly more complicated gradient. You simply use one of these keywords from, via, and to specify a breakpoint for the gradients. You're still going to need to specify a direction with a background image class. Now, if you only specify a from color stop, it will go to white. So actually, let's take a look at the example because I think it makes always more sense. So notice the first one, let's see. The first one does a from red to purple 500, and then it has that background gradient to a specific section. So notice that I'm going to, and you saw the example before. I'm saying I want you to go to a specific section. And let's see the other one from red 600. And this is where you specify a breakpoint here via yellow 300. So I think this must be this yellow one right here to purple 500, right? And then you specify the direction. So you can get some pretty cool gradients. I mean, you can possibly design the gradients yourself, but Tailwind CSS has this entire language that are essentially shortcuts to create different kinds of classes. And the gradient and color classes are an example where it's not just giving you styles that match what CSS would give you. It's actually almost riffing and give you some additional styles that you can use. So as I mentioned before, Tailwind CSS classes are usually designed to be exact clones of CSS classes, but there are some classes that are really more like shortcuts. And we saw examples of that with the colors and especially the color gradient classes. Those were all shortcuts to creating gradients. So let's talk about a few other ones that I think are pretty useful. So we have actually a very useful font family class, and they allow you to set the font family. Normally, everything in Tailwind CSS is a sans serif font, but you can also specify a serif font with font serif and then a font mono as well if you wanted to do some sort of monospaced coding type font. And you can always overwrite what those are. So by going into the theme section of your customization, and we'll talk about customization later. So you can go in there and modify the, say, font family to be something else. Because a lot of times we don't really want the default fonts. We want something else. And usually the fonts are system fonts. So it's using whatever the operating system provides as the standard sans serif font. And we can even create additional sort of font styles if we want to, like this. So it's very, very flexible. And if you see how they look, you can pretty much see that they're just basic sans serif fonts, and mono fonts as well. So pretty useful. And as I mentioned, it normally just uses system fonts, and they're easily customizable if you need to do that as well. Another place where you see this is, strangely enough, in font size. The font size is actually a combination of the font size and the line height, which is in rems. So when you specify these different scaled font sizes, you can see that they are not just the size of the font, but then also the line height, which makes sense because, you know, bigger fonts sometimes need different line heights than smaller fonts. And so you could see kind of the different examples of the scales that we have with Tailwind CSS. Pretty useful font scale. I pretty much use it all the time. I mean, text 9 XL, pretty big. I don't know that I need anything bigger than that, but you might. And so you can also use custom different sizes. So we'll talk about that in a different video as well. So there's also a way to create shadows, which again are sort of shortcuts to styles in CSS. And you can take a look at what they actually do. So the shadows to me are very mild. So look at shadow medium. I personally feel that I can barely see this. The large shadow, maybe it's a little bit more visible. I don't know. Maybe I'm just being picky. The 2XL shadow is, I don't know. None of them seem to me very dramatic. You can also specify things like the inner shadow and then also that there's no shadow, because sometimes you need a reset type of class, and that's what this one allows you to do. So the inner shadow is actually placing a small shadow inside the element. Honestly, I can't see it, at least on this screen, but they're telling me in the manual that it does. So there's actually another class, another set of classes that are shortcuts, and this is the screen reader classes. They allow you to specify that you want an item to only show up on screen readers and not in the browser. This may be good for textual content that is more suitable for things that are a little bit visual. So a way to tell screen readers what it is you're showing, and it's something that you're not going to be able to see on screen. And then the opposite, of course, there's always a reset class with a lot of these, is the not SR only. So if you take a look at this example, you can see that on certain items here, they're sort of defined as being screen reader only. So you can see a screen reader only, and then you can specify certain things to not be on screen reader only. It's a useful class, and it's one that is actually, if you look at the documentation, it's a combination of CSS classes. So there's a couple of other of these types of classes in Tailwind CSS, but they're very rare. So I'm not including the sort of places where one of the items has a combination of things. But these are the basic classes that I believe are what I'm calling the shortcut classes, things that are really a combination of things. There are some totally unique classes to Tailwind CSS. Let's take a look at what they do. Now, one of my favorite is the divide class. With this class, you can essentially put lines in between items, and you start off by creating a class of divide with a direction. The direction can be horizontal or vertical. So if you have, like, say, a bunch of list items and they're right on top of one another, then you can add a line in between them. And then you can define an amount. This will be like the thickness of the line. And then you can also specify the opacity along with the color. So this would be where you would put in divide and then like indigo 500 and then slash and opacity value. So you could say like 50 for 50% or 90 for 90%. And then you can also add a style. The styles are one of these different keywords right here. So let's take a look at them in action. And you can see that I have lines in between these items right here. And I've added a bunch of these different styles. So we have divide dashed, divide Y2, so vertical direction, and a thickness of 2. And then we define the divide color here, indigo 600 at 70% opacity, which works pretty well. Right. In addition to that, we have this other very strange sets of classes for creating rings. They're very similar to borders, but they kind of can go outside of borders. So you can actually use them with borders if you want to. They're especially useful for like buttons, for sort of styling like focus styles or things like that. So you specify the ring class with an amount, which can be one of these. You can also specify a color, just like with any other color. So ring dash orange dash 300 or something like that, and then slash an opacity setting. And then you can also, the rings can be offset from the item. So it can be like a little bit of space between like the button and the sort of outside ring. And then you can specify the offset color if you want to as well. So let's take a look at an example of that. And this is what I'm talking about. You have like the button, and then you have like a little bit of a space in between, and then an offset. And then you can specify the colors for the different parts of that. So you can say ring offset 1, ring pink 500, and then the thickness of the ring. And these kind of play together. So like the thickness of the ring plus the offset kind of play together to determine the actual full thickness of the element. And then you have the background color. Right now, all these are the same. And so that's pretty much how you do rings, and you'll see them all over the place. They're also really good for any form elements, not just buttons, because sometimes you can add a ring, say for validation on certain form elements, and that gives the user a little bit more feedback on certain types of projects. Tailwind CSS has a set of responsive modifiers that allow you to target what happens to your styles at certain breakpoints. Now, this feature works with every utility class in the framework and also with custom sizes. It's one of the things that makes the framework so powerful. You can see that the breakpoints here are pretty similar to what you would find in Bootstrap. There's an SM, MD, LG, XL, and 2XL. However, the breakpoints begin with minimum widths and grow from there. So there isn't a range. It's just starting at a specific breakpoint and then from then on. This is equivalent to creating an add media query with a minimum width that you specify to one of these numbers right here. As I mentioned, this does affect every utility class in the framework, and it's also a mobile-first approach, so the classes will affect the current breakpoint and any breakpoints above that. That means that by default, if you say something like BG Purple 500, it's going to affect everything that is a mobile size and above. Everything between the medium breakpoint and the large breakpoint will be BG Green 500, and anything that is at the large breakpoint or bigger will be BG Purple 500. All right, let's check out an example. So here you can see that I have a layout, and what happens is that when I get to a certain breakpoint, it goes to a top and bottom layout. And also when I get to a certain size, the font size right here for this stargazers gets a little bit smaller. That's because this is a pretty aggressively large font size right here, and it needs to be smaller at that breakpoint. So let's see how I did that. So what I have here is a main that is the container for everything. And that's normally a flex class and also a flex column. But at the extra large breakpoint, that goes from a column to a row. And in there are essentially two divs. One div is to be normally full width, which is what you see when I make this smaller. So when I am like this, these sort of pieces are full width. And when I get to a larger breakpoint, the XL breakpoint, they're going to take up half of the screen like this. Now, the other thing that's controlling the layout is that over here at the XL breakpoint, I switch from columns to rows. And so that means that they're going to appear side by side, and each one of them is going to take up half of the width. And the other thing that I'm doing here is whenever I get to the specific font right here, so this stargazers text that you see right there is normally a text 6XL, but when it gets to a medium breakpoint, it switches to a text 8XL. So you'll notice that when I get to a certain size, it's still right now 8XL. And when I get to another size, it's going to get a little bit smaller, 6XL. And that's how the breakpoints work. They're pretty easy to use, but you do have to sort of think of doing the layout mobile first. So I would always start with what you want it to look in a mobile sort of size, and then work on the design for the larger sizes. It's a little bit easier to get through a layout by thinking of it in a mobile first fashion and then making adjustments for the larger screens. Although the built-in sizes for content is great, one of the best features in Tailwind is the ability to let you specify your own custom sizes. This is pretty easy. You can use just about any measurement that you would use in CSS. You can also use this with any of the modifiers to control how things work in different instances. So here, for example, I'm saying that at the large breakpoint, I want to change the width of this element to 80%. You can even use this to create a custom class. So this is the equivalent of using a style attribute, but within the class section. Now, why wouldn't you just use a style attribute? Well, this will also work with modifiers. So you can do something that is, for example, on hover, then add any style you want within brackets. Now, there are some things that you have to watch out for. So for example, if you are using any sort of name in your CSS that has a space, then you want to use an underscore instead. Sometimes if you have to use an underscore with a space or some other instance where you need to escape something, you use the slash. And there are some instances where you need to force a certain value type. That's because certain classes like the text class can be used with a variable set to different values. So normally you would say like text purple 500. So if you just say text dash and then use a variable name here, then it wouldn't know that it's not the text, say, white or text black. And so you have to add this color colon right here to specify that you're actually modifying the color of the text. So let's take a look at an example where I've done some interesting things. Now here I have set the width of this item to be 80% of the viewport width at the Excel breakpoint. So whenever I get to a certain size, you'll see that this just collapses to like a full width view, not 80% anymore. That's pretty cool. And I didn't have to worry about what the proper measurement here was. I just added 80% to the width and then used this modifier here. So that's pretty awesome. Another place where I have used this is in the text color of the word stargazers. You see here that I'm using a variable called primary, and I've defined that variable in the CSS section of the style sheet. So this is just a regular sort of CSS extra style sheet, and I can now then use any CSS variables into my Tailwind CSS classes. And then in addition to that, I did something pretty interesting here with the text size. So what I'm using here is the clamp CSS property to add essentially what is a variable with font. So the stargazers will actually get smaller as you make the width of the window smaller. And that's using this CSS clamp property, which is pretty interesting. And here you can see sort of a cool use of these brackets notation to use just about any value that you want in your layouts. It's clearly by far one of the most powerful features of the framework. What's also really cool is that Tailwind CSS is actually generating a custom version of your style sheet. So when the style sheets are output into your final project, you will get essentially a custom version of this text clamp style. And so we're not really creating a huge style sheet. It's only always going to use the styles that you've added in your layout and nothing else. So unlike something like Bootstrap, where you are getting everything, whether or not you use it, with Tailwind CSS, you're only getting the CSS to output the things that you're using in your layout, even special things like this, which are custom properties. All right, it's time for a challenge. So in this challenge, I want you to take what you've learned and add to a layout that I'll be showing you in just a minute to do a few things that you've learned and some things that you're going to have to use the documentation to look up. Here's the basics. I want you to add rounded borders to a set of cards, and I want you to center the cards within the layout. Also, I want you to modify the cards so that they have a custom width. And I want you to add a red border, a shadow, and scale it when somebody hovers over the cards. Finally, I'm going to ask you to look up in the manual how to do transition and easing and do that for the cards. And finally, I want to say that you should try to have fun with this and do a layout that looks pretty cool. Try to do something different than what I'm going to show you and have a little bit of extra fun and see where you can take it. Now, here's a sample of what this is going to look like when you're done. You see the cards are right here, and as you hover over them, we get a little bit of a drop shadow, and then this border turns from gray to red, and this card is scaling when you roll over any of the elements. And notice that this is a slider layout, so you can get to some additional elements as you scroll over them. So here's where we're going to start with. If you roll over this challenge button here, you'll notice the URL for the challenge, and here's the URL for the solution, where I have all the code for everything already finished. Let's take a look at the challenge and we'll see what we start with. So we have this code, and I've done almost everything for you, but I left these two different divs with empty classes for you to finish up. And you can see that we're missing the gray border. These aren't quite the right size. They're actually different sizes, as you can see. And there is no borders and no hover states. So see if you can figure this out, and honestly, I expect you to play around and see what else you can do with Tailwind CSS and this particular layout. All right, let's see how I'm going to solve this particular problem. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change the width here, and the scale here isn't quite what I want. I want to create a custom width. So I'm going to use brackets here and set this to 300 pixels. This is going to make sure that these cards are consistent in width and give me a little bit more breathing room in between each one of these elements. I think these aliens look a lot better when they're a little bit wider. So pretty cool. Now let's get into this one, which is the more complicated one. So for this, I'm going to use a flex column layout and make sure that I add flex in here. This will make sure that these elements inside the cards are now centered. And I'm going to add a rounded to Excel class here. And I'm going to add a border so that we can see the round edges of gray 200 and a border class. So now this is going to give me the border around each of the cards, and the border is going to be gray 200, which looks pretty good. I'm going to add a little bit extra room here by adding a 2-unit margin at the top and the bottom, just so that we have a little bit more breathing room between this little scroller right here, and also at the very top of this card. All right, I'm gonna now set up what's gonna happen when the cards get hovered. So I'm gonna say scale here. So I'm gonna set the scale to 90%. So these cards will actually get a little bit smaller. And then what I wanna do is whenever I hover, I'm going to set the scale to 100. So now when I roll over these cards, they're going to be a little bit bigger. And that's a pretty cool effect. But as you can see, it's a little bit jarring when it just jumps to that size. So I'm going to add a little bit of a transition. But before I do that, let me add some other things here. So I'm going to say when I hover, I'm going to do a shadow just on the element that I hovered. And this will be 2XL. So now when I hover over these elements, notice that I get a little bit of a shadow just on the element that I'm hovering over. And I'll also do hover and then border red 500. Cool. And let's add the transition so that it's a little bit softer. I'll do transition and I'll do an ease in and out. This will make it a little bit slower. So I always change the word ease to slow, and then in to beginning and out at the end. So this will make it a little bit slower at the beginning and slower at the end. So it's not so much of a jarring jump into the bigger size, which I think looks pretty good. Now we can also slow down the animation a little bit by setting the duration property here to 500. And you can see that it's a little bit slower, getting bigger and smaller, which I think also looks a little bit better. Cool. So that is quite a few things. I'd love to see what you do. And if you do try this, go ahead and send me the link on LinkedIn. You can find me at LinkedIn/in/Planet of the Web. And you can send me a link to the CodePen showing your own version of what you did. Tailwind CSS lets you modify your content depending on the state of certain pseudo-class selectors. The most common of this one is hover, and we've been using it here and there in different videos. This is probably the most common state, and it refers to when you roll over an element, you can have it do something else. So let's take a look at it. So you can see that when I roll over this button, it changes a bunch of different things about the button. To highlight it a little bit better, you can see that I've added a ring of 2 units. And that gives it that thicker sort of border around the edges. I've also offset that ring so that it leaves a little bit of space in between. And then I've modified the color of the ring as well as the background. So you can add not just one thing, but a bunch of different other elements that you want to modify. The rest of it is just a pretty simple button here, but you can see that the hover does make a big impact. Another state that you can work with is called focus. This affects an element, of course, when it has focus. And like every other class in Tailwind CSS, it refers to something in CSS. You may already be familiar with this concept of focus. And you add the focus modifier, but then there's also a focus within, as well as a focus visible. So focus is the basic one. Focus within modifies an element when its descendant has focus. And focus visible modifies an element when you're using the keyboard to focus. So those are very slight variations of focus. Let's take a look at how it works. All right, so here's 3 buttons, and notice that the first one, in order to focus this one, I have to click on it. See, now it sort of becomes active, and it currently has focus. You can see that I did some of the same things that I did in the previous button here. I did the focus ring, the offset, and the sort of width of the ring right here. Now the second one, when I click on it, notice that what I'm actually doing is activating the parent element and giving the parent element a background. So if you look at the way that I built this, I created a div around the button, and that's where I put focus within. So any items that are in focus inside this div will cause this div to have a background color of yellow. And that's what's happening right here when I click on this second button. Now the last one is going to be a little difficult to sort of figure out, and it refers to only whenever you have focus with the keyboard. So you have to click somewhere up here and then tab a few times, and you'll see that as I tab, the different elements will gain focus. And then when I get to this one, you can see that it has a little bit of an outline. And you can see all the classes that I'm doing here. I'm doing an orange ring of 600, which is a little bit darker. It looks kind of like red. So it's a slight difference in the functionality, but you can see the difference between the 3 with this example. Right, so there's also a way to do things with links. And again, these refer to the things that you could do with regular CSS. So for example, we have an active class. So you modify a link when it's in an active state. That means when you are in the process of clicking an element, you could have it give the user an additional nice little bit of extra feedback. Now the other one is visited. This is for links that have been previously visited. You've probably seen this already on websites. We'll show you an example in just a minute. Now you can modify anything about the display of visited links with this modifier. Finally is a target element. And you've probably seen this one, but it's a bit weird in terms of what you can do with it. It lets you modify an element as long as the ID of the element matches the URL fragment. Now this appears on your URL after a hashtag. It's not particularly useful, but let's take a look at an example so that you can see what it does. So I'm going to hit this right here and take a look at these links right here. So right now I just have sort of hover classes that have on each one of these links, you can see that there's going to be a border, and the border will highlight when I hover. So I actually have those a little bit later on. So notice it says like hover border pink, right? And normally the border is colored transparent. So what you want to do with these kind of things is you want to leave the space for the border if you're going to sort of have it there. And you could do that by making the color transparent. And then you modify the color of the border whenever you hover. If you just deleted this border transparent, then you would see like a little bit of a jump when you hover, and that's not very good. But more importantly, notice that I have this active class right here. And with this active class, I'm saying that whenever this element is active, I want you to change the color of the text to pink. So if I click on this button while I'm holding the button down, you can see that it changes to pink. And that's what's happening whenever I click on any one of these. And these are designed to sort of scroll to a position on the screen. Now, the other one that you may see on some websites is the visited link. And for that, I'm going to have to click on this element right here. This actually takes you to my blog, right? And if I go back into my page, you'll see that because I have visited this link, this is now a little bit darker. So to do that, I added a visited modifier right here and said that the text will be colored gray 900, which is a little bit darker than the other ones. And so it sort of stands out to show you which links I've already visited. That's kind of useful. I don't really look for those slight differences in color on websites, but some people find that useful, so you can do that. Now, the last one, as I mentioned, is the target link. And that is a little bit different and sort of weird to understand. So if I click on this interact piece, notice that it scrolls down to this interact with the stargazers section right here. So if I take a look at my URL, I don't know if this is going to work on CodePen, but normally when you click on some of these links, what will happen in your URL is that you would see a hashtag here at the end, right? So it'll say like hashtag and then the ID. So it could be something like hashtag and then cast on a normal website, not on this playground. So what that's doing is it's saying, I want you to go to a fragment within this page that has the ID of cast. So let's say I go to interact here. So this one has an ID of interact. You see that the ID is right here. All of these different segments or pieces of the page have different IDs. So social, cast, interact. And that is how, when I click on some of these, it goes into those sections. And you notice that I have a nice little scroll here. That's because if I go to the settings section and I go to HTML, I have added this class called Scroll Smooth. If you don't have this, it'll just jump to that point on the page. I've also added a little bit of padding, so I have a little bit of extra room at the top because my navigation is now sort of fixed to the top, so you can see it when I move up and down the page. Now, here's what's happening with the target. So if you take a look at any one of these items, notice that they have a target class of PT or padding at the top of 16 units. So what that's doing is adding a little bit of padding when I click on these elements, and where that is useful. So this is meat. So let's go to the interact section, right? And let's see. And I'm not doing it with the interact section. Let's go to the cast section, right? And you can see that I can see the cast section here at the top. And if we take that out, let's take out the target. It has to refresh a little bit here. All right, so once it reloads, let's go ahead and go to cast and see what happens when I take this out. Notice that my headline, my little header at the very top is missing. That's because when it's going to this ID, the cast ID, it's actually going to position this at the top of the page. And because it's at the top, I can't see the thing that is underneath this white background because it's got this navigation on top of it. So what I can do with this one is add a little bit of room whenever I click on this item so that it gives me a little bit of extra padding, but only when I click on one of these items. If I was just scrolling normally, I wouldn't be able to see that extra space. It only appears when I click on one of these elements, and I can control that so that it can give me a little bit of extra padding before the element by using this target attribute. That's kind of the only reason I found it useful. You can also have it, say, change the background color to some other background color, but it isn't extremely useful in that sense because it doesn't really, I don't know, add much to the way that the page works. Whereas when I'm using these sort of scroll position IDs, the target's actually useful by giving me a little bit of room so that it doesn't scroll this all the way to the top, but it moves it down by, in this case, 24 pixels. You don't have to have that everywhere. Sometimes when you click on things, it scrolls to the proper place, but sometimes you may need to add that in some places to make things work. There's also some modifiers that apply depending on the position of certain elements. Let's take a look at those. There's a whole bunch of modifiers that let you control the position of elements like the first element as well as the first of type. The difference here is that the second one modifies an element only if it is the first child of its type, as opposed to the other one just modifies whatever the first element is. It doesn't matter what type it is. There's also a corresponding last and last of type. They're pretty similar. And again, they have them in Tailwind CSS because these are available in CSS. Not something I use all the time, but they're there. And then there's also, if it's the only element, then that would be styled a certain way, as well as the only of type, which would be only an element of a specific type. Let's take a look at how they work. All right, so we have these different elements here, and you can see that I have added the first item right here, the first modifier to all these elements. Now remember that in Tailwind CSS, most of the time you're going to be doing things that are generated by some sort of data object. So you usually use this with React. And so you'll be creating some sort of module that applies this a bunch of times to the same or similar elements that are loading in from some data. So see here that I'm using the same element first for all these elements, but it's only modifying the first one. That's because that's what that does. It only modifies the first. If I were to put last here, it would only highlight the last element. And it doesn't matter here if I put first or last of type. It would do the same thing in this instance because these elements are of the same type already. So it doesn't matter. So if, for example, this was a div instead of an anchor tag, then that would matter if you say first or last as opposed to first of type or last of type. Now to see what only and only of type would do, I would have to modify this thing to say only. And if I do that, you'll notice that the yellow will not appear anywhere unless I delete all of these elements except for one. So if this is the only element, then that element will have that yellow background like that. That's what the only and the only of type do. There's also some elements that work on the order of items. This is actually pretty good for things like tables. So you have the odd or the even modifier. And so we're taking a look at it with our same sort of element list. And you can see that when I say even, then the second one and the fourth one are highlighted. And of course, if I did odd, it would do the opposite here. So I think that's pretty useful, especially probably on tables. The availability modifier is called empty, and it lets you modify an element if that element has no content. So you definitely have to see this one to understand what it does. So if we click on this example, you'll see that there's one item missing right here. So there are still 4 items here, but one of them doesn't have any content. So this one right here doesn't have any content. And so what I'm doing here is I added the hidden value. Now, even though it has a width and a height here, it's just going to hide this element. Now, again, remember that most of the time when you're using Tailwind CSS, you're going to be using it with something that is going to be generating the content from a database. So in certain instances, you are going to run into either fields that are returning from a database or entire elements that might not have any content for the fields that you're retrieving. So this is kind of a useful way of controlling what happens if you get something back from the data and it doesn't actually have any content. You want to delete the element, you want to, I don't know, put a line underneath it or something. So this is actually quite useful. All right, there's one more, and this is in the family of things that I would never use. It sort of looks to me like what you would do if you were typesetting an old style book, and they are the first letter and first line modifiers. They're pretty self-explanatory. The first letter modifier, so I just created one of these items here, will let you control what happens to the first letter of an element. So in this case, it's this P right here. I guess I could have colored it red, but it was already pretty ugly by making it larger here. And then you can also control the first line. So here I also just made the text a little bigger for this first line. Sometimes this kind of works, like the first line. I feel like it works. The first letter, I have never seen it look great, especially on the web. But again, Tailwind CSS is just trying to mimic all the available classes that you have with regular CSS. And so that's why you get these ones that maybe you would never use. Let's take a look at some of the form modifiers that we can use with Tailwind CSS. Now, there's actually a lot of different states that we can check for, and these have to do with the different properties that you can add to forms. So there's going to be a lot of these. So for example, you can check to see if a form has the disable property attached to an element. You can also verify it for the checked property. Indeterminate means that a element like a checkbox or a radio button hasn't been interfered with. So when the page first loads, you haven't done anything with those buttons, and that means that the application doesn't know what you've done with any of these, and so it gives it an indeterminate state. So you can style that accordingly to whatever you want with this modifier. Default means that you can style something if it has the default value when the page initially loaded, and that would be relevant to something like an option, a checkbox, or a radio field. Placeholder shown means that You can modify the input, of course, when the placeholder is being shown. And sometimes you can create a placeholder attribute to any of different input fields. And so that's what it would do right here. And then autofill, it's kind of interesting. It modifies an input when it has been autofilled by the browser. So sometimes when you're filling out a form, it sort of shows a drop down with some autofill options, and that's what it's allowing you to style. One of the interesting things about Tailwind is that it doesn't have any form-specific styles. You just use the regular styles that you use for like buttons. So you can use borders, you can use rings, you can use textiles, and so on and so forth. Another property that you can use is this read-only property, of course, if you've added that into an input field. Let's go through some of them. I haven't used all these in this example because it's just a crazy amount of items. However, I feel free to try these out yourself. Honestly, you're going to learn so much more by playing around with these things. So let's take a look at what we have here. So we have this disabled field, and notice that it has this grayed out background. So that's something that I've done here. So if I look for the about section, so let's look for the text area field. Text. Let's do text area. So here it is. So it has the disabled attribute turned on, and this is what most of them would look like. So if you have disabled, you can have required, you can have a placeholder, which would be a property. So you can see the placeholder actually right here. But if you have disabled, then you can create a disabled class and then do something with that modifier. So you can say disabled and then make the background color gray 100. So any of those things, if you scroll down further, let's make this a little bit bigger, you notice that for the subscribe button, if it is checked, I'm putting this sort of outline of red. So if it's unchecked, it doesn't have that. If I click on this, it will have that outline. And also I've used the indeterminate modifier so that if I haven't done anything with these notifications, it's showing these red outlines. And so as soon as I click on one of these, notice that they're both going to go. And that's because they no longer have an indeterminate property. So you could see that all the way down here. So notice that here I'm saying if the element is indeterminate, go ahead and give it a ring of 2 and then a red sort of color to that ring. The same thing with this other property. And I'm doing something similar for the checkbox, right? So whenever that checkbox is checked, then I can add a ring to it as well. So any of those things relate to the different properties and the additional fields that you can add on the different input type elements or the radio type elements or the radio input fields or the select boxes. I gave you a form here that has a few of those elements, and you can see buttons down here as well. So having said that, let's take a look at some validation items that you can check for. You can style something when an element or an item has a required property on it. You can also check to see if an item is valid, and this refers to the JavaScript validation that forms do by default. So if you have specified, for example, that a field is required, then if you don't fill out that field, then the browser will know that that field has a valid or an invalid state, depending on whether or not you filled it out, and so on and so forth. So for certain types of elements, so for say like the ones that you drag, the sliders that you drag, things can be within a range or out of range. And so you can style things with that modifier as well. So I've done a couple of these here. Again, I'm not doing all of them for these. So you could see here that at the top for this element, what I have done is I said that if it's invalid, it's going to have a border of red. And then the border is going to be a little bit thicker. So invalid border 2. And because this is now a required field, it currently has an invalid state because it doesn't have anything in it. As soon as I type in my name here, it no longer has that red border. So that is one way in which I've done this. And for the email, I've also set this field to be required. And then I added that a required field will have a background of orange 50, or at least that this particular field, if it is required, it's going to have that background. So it's as easy as that. The weird thing about Tailwind CSS is that it just has sort of styles or sort of hooks to any property that you have in your HTML. And also it tends to reflect any existing classes. So you'll see things like that. If you have a required attribute, then there is a way to target that and then style that based on the state of that field. And I mentioned that there was one field, one very special field that has a modifier that you can use to style it. And this is actually the only form specific kind of class in Tailwind CSS. And you've seen it. It's this file section right here. So you can style anything about this file button by using the file modifier. It's weird because you don't see that with anything else. So somewhere around here I have, input type file. And notice that for classes, I have a bunch of different properties for those fields. So I have a margin right of 2. I'm not sure. I guess the margin right would be right here to the right of the button. And then padding Y2, so a little bit of room at the top and bottom, and a little bit of room on each side as well. And then I have a rounded MD, so that's what's giving me this button with the rounded edges. And then I have, for the file, I have a border solid, a border with a color, and then I have some other things in here. So you can see that with this file attribute, you can style anything about the file component that most browsers will use. So here I'm just making it this gray 500. So the text here is gray 500, the background's going to be white, etc., etc. And this is sort of weird because it's like the only form specific field. There isn't anything special for like a select or for any type of input field. Just happens that there is one for files. Let's take a look at another one of the powerful set of modifiers that allow you to control what happens when you have a child element or a sibling element. These are pretty cool and very useful. So with the child modifiers, you set up an element that is the parent element that has a class of group, and then you find elements inside that group, and then you can modify something about those elements related to the entire group. Okay, this is really hard to visualize. So of course I have a good example. This is going to make perfect sense, hopefully, when I show you this. And so what we have here is some social media icons. And normally what would happen if I roll over one of these pieces of text is that this text would highlight, right? Which is doing right now. It's changing it to this orange color. But notice that if I go over the icon, it's also going to highlight this text. Even though I'm rolling over the icon, the text is being highlighted. So how am I doing that? All right, so let me look for this LinkedIn logo right here. And what you could see is that I created this anchor tag right here. I gave it a class of group, and then I said, all right, well, when you hover over the group, go ahead and make the text here indigo 500. And that's how we're doing this trick. We're saying create a group and then use any of the modifiers here. So group and then dash something. It can be one of several different classes. So it could be like focus or active. It works with forms pretty well, you know, odd or even and things like that, so that it will activate on the sort of group hover instead of the individual hover. Super useful and super cool because sometimes you really want to do this. And what would happen is if I took this group out here, I don't know if I have to take the other one out. So this is for the LinkedIn logo. Notice that now when I roll over the LinkedIn logo, it's not making this text purple. So that is super, super helpful. All right, let's take a look at another really useful one. And this is the sibling modifiers. They're similar, but they set up the items that are available to be controlled as peers. So we put these in a sibling element. Again, I don't know that this is going to make a lot of sense until you see it. So you have, just like with group, you have a, not necessarily a parent in this case, but this is when you want something to be related to something at the same level. Whereas group, you're working with the parent. And let's just show you how it works because it'll make more sense. So this is how you would do some sort of form validation message. And so we have this message right here, and so you can see that it says a name is required, right? And what I'm doing is I'm saying that I have up here that I want you to look at when determining what's going on with this item right here. And so if this peer that I've set up, which is this input field, is invalid for some reason, then I want you to style it a certain way. So I'm saying peer invalid, set it to a block, which means that normally if I type in a name here, then because it is now valid, that paragraph is going to be hidden. But whenever I don't have a name in there, the browser determines that it is invalid. And so it will show this element as a block element. And then it will also apply any of these other things. So peer invalid font makes the font bold, makes it red 500. And so that is how you do this. If you were wondering, how do I do sort of the validation message that disappears when I type in something? That's how you do that. Pretty awesome and also super useful. You can target elements by using some modifiers that let you change the way the Tailwind interacts with certain attributes. There's an important attribute that you can use with HTML that lets you set up your page to support both right to left typography as well as left to right. You can turn this on by using the dir property, and this normally goes in the HTML tag so that you can set this up. The Tailwind has two modifiers that let you define how your code will react to this. You can include an RTL modifier or an LTR modifier, and that's right to left or left to right. Let's take a look at how they work. You can see that on this page, I've created this HTML tag here, and I've set the direction here to be LTR or left to right. And down here, a little bit further, I've actually created two items, this list item right here and this other one right here. Notice that this second one has a different direction so that you can turn that on a per direction level and then define things that change whenever you're in the specific direction. So here I had to adjust the margin so that normally the margin would go to the right of the item. On a right to left screen, the margin has to go to the left of the item. So that's how you do that. You can modify that on a per item basis. So you can say whenever you are in right to left mode, put the margin to the left. And when you are in left to right mode, put the margin to the right. And you can do that with other properties as well. So notice that I am aligning the text in that fashion as well. Now, right to left and left to right is something that you want to turn on if you need a site to support both directions. If you don't need a site to support both directions, so say that you're doing a site that is strictly meant for US consumption, then you don't need these properties at all. There's also another property that lets you work with different elements like the details or the dialog HTML tags to control what happens when items are opened or closed. And you just simply add an open modifier, and then you can change the way that something works. So let's check that one out. So here is my cast of stargazers. And these have been created with a details tag right here. The details tag has a summary as well as a div. And notice that here I'm saying what to do when an item is open. So I say the open tag right here. And then I say that when I open one of these elements, let's go ahead and open one of these. I am using a specific type of padding here and a little bit of margin maybe at the top. So let's see if we can see that a little bit better. So yeah, the margin in the X and Y direction is a little larger than normal. So 3 units in the vertical orientation, and then the padding as well is a little bit different than normal. That's because I want the sort of individual items to be a little bit sort of next to each other. And notice that I'm also changing the color here of the text. So I can say, and here I'm using a group class or a group open class, right? So I created each one of these items as a group, and then I can say group open, and then modify the color of the text when one of these items is open. This is a pretty handy modifier for those particular types of elements where you really want to customize the look and feel of certain things whenever they are open. It's specifically for the elements that I mentioned, which is either the details or the dialog tags. There are some special modifiers that target CSS pseudo-elements. So let's take a look at those. The first is the list markers. Now, this is a way to control the styles of, say, like the bullet points or the numbers that you would normally see on list items. So let's take a look. Pretty simple and easy to use. What you do is you use this marker modifier, and then you can define the style of the elements with a specific list type. And there's just a few different list types. So I think the other one is decimal that you can use here, and this would be the numbers. And notice that now the numbers are colored pink. There's also a list none, which is the default, but you really are only going to see this take effect when you use either list disk or list decimal. There's also a way to control the color of the selection. And this is kind of interesting because with this selection modifier, you can control that on a per item basis. This is quite useful and definitely something you want to do when we get into dark mode. But here, normally the operating system defines what the color of a selection is, but you can override that by using this selection modifier here. And now when I'm in this paragraph and I select something, I can control the color. Here I'm setting the background color to pink and then the text color to pink 800. Background pink 300, which is this sort of lighter pink color, and then pink 800 for the color of the text. That's pretty cool. There are some modifiers that are related to how certain media queries work. Now, this first one's really important. There's a couple of special modifiers that let you control how elements behave when users have certain operating system settings. So the first one is reduce motion or motion reduce. And then there's one for motion safe. And the way that these work, let's check out the example here, is by letting you determine what will happen or how something will animate, for example, when you are in a certain mode. So I'm going to jump off of full screen mode here for a second and show you that there are a handful of animation styles. And notice that I've added these different properties here, or the different modifiers that let you control what happens when somebody has things set up to motion safe. And one of the animation functions is animate bounce. And if somebody has chosen motion reduce, then this will set to animate none. So to actually see that in action, I'm going to go to System Preferences, and I'm on a Mac, so I need to go to Accessibility and look for this Display tab right here. And then in here, I can turn on or off Reduce Motion. So this is a system-wide setting, and it's going to depend on which device you're doing this in. This will be in different places in different devices. But here it is on a Mac, and you can see that as soon as I turn that on, the reduce motion setting will mean that this item will take into effect. So you can make anything happen related to animations by using and controlling these two different sort of toggles with motion reduce and motion save. There's a couple of other media query settings, and they really depend on the device that you're using. I'm working on a desktop here, so I'm just going to mention them. But in the same way, you can control whether something like a mobile device happens to be in portrait or landscape mode by using these two modifiers. So you can say whenever you're in landscape mode, do this, and on portrait mode, do something else. And there's also another one for working with your printer. So whenever you print something, you can say, if you have a sort of complex background, you can say not to maybe display that background whenever somebody prints, just to not annoy them with an artsy or a colorful background when people just want to print something simple. So I love dark mode, and all my computers are now set up to dark mode. That is a preference in every operating system or device. On a Mac, you can find that in the General tab here. And you go to General and you can determine the light mode or dark mode, or you can set it to auto. So in the mornings, it will be in light mode, and then in the afternoons or evenings, it'll be in dark mode. I always have mine set up to dark mode. You can actually control that with a special modifier called dark. So by default, it's going to assume that you want light mode, and then when you add this modifier, you can determine how the layout will look on dark mode, and I think it's awesome. So I have this example here, and you can see that I'm doing a lot of different things here. As I mentioned, I do have dark mode set on, so notice that I have this dark mode text indigo and text yellow, so this yellow right here. And if you notice, there's another text indigo 600. So normally the sort of indigo color here will be a little bit darker on normal mode, and in dark mode it'll be a little bit lighter. Similar things are happening in other places. So here actually I changed the color completely to like a yellow 500, but on normal mode it's a text gray 900. So you can see me use this sprinkled throughout, and the way that you do this, let's get out of full screen mode. And we will kind of put this over to the side, and I want to show more of my design here. So now if I switch to light mode, you can see how it normally looks. I added this gray color to the background and rounded edges. And then when somebody is in dark mode, you can give them a completely different design based on those two things. I really love this. You can really try all of these different samples that I've created for you. Spend some time playing around with some of these things. And notice that for this particular one, I've also added a framework called Alpine.js, and it is going through some data right here, and that's actually what's generating this list of items from this X data attribute here. So definitely play around with all the examples because they're pretty awesome. And I love dark mode so much that I enjoy making my designs really shine for dark mode, because that is what I always use. All right, it's time for another challenge. In this one, we're going to create a dark mode version of our layout, as well as use groups to handle how we do rollovers. So let's take a look at what we need to do. So what we're going to do is fade out the image. Whenever you hover on any part of the image, I want you to fade the image back in. Now, this is not just fading whenever somebody's over the image itself, but on any part of the card as well. I also want you to create a dark mode version of the design. You'll need to adjust the colors, especially in the header as well as in the cards. So I have the beginning and ending versions of this. You can see the URL for the beginning version here, and here's the solution. Let's take a look at that first. Now here's what I did. You can see that when I roll over these, there's a little bit of a faded effect on all the cards, but whenever I roll on any part of the card, it's actually making all of the hover transitions available, and everything kind of looks nice to me in dark mode. And I do have dark mode already turned on in the operating system. So if you need to do that, I'm on a Mac, so I can go to the system preferences and then go to the general section, and I can turn on dark mode. If that's not on, then you're not going to be able to design the difference. Let's take a look at how we are starting. So here we just pretty much have the same layout that we did before, with all the hovering over these different items and the scrolling. So it's pretty much just taking the layout that we did in the previous challenge and then adding these two things, making the sort of image be a little bit less opaque until we roll things over, as well as designing everything for dark mode. Good luck, and remember to have fun. Let's start working on this. So to take care of this, we are going to first set the opacity of the image. And I'll use the custom value here to set this to 0.5. So it's going to make the images just be faded out a little bit. And then what I want to do is whenever I hover over the image, I can set the opacity to 100. And so now if I hover over the image will be 100. Notice that if I hover down here, though, the image doesn't really change. And I can fix that by grouping things. So I'm going to set this up as a group up here. And now I can do a group hover. So group dash hover. And now whenever I go over any part of the card, it's going to make the opacity here 100%, which is pretty cool. All right, so let's work on dark mode. I already have the settings for my operating system in dark mode, but we're not seeing the layout except dark mode. So let's go ahead and I'll start off by going to settings. I'm using CodePen here. So in the HTML, what I want to do is make sure that the background, if there is dark mode or if dark mode is turned on, then I need to set the background to BG. I'll use the slate color and I'll set it to 800. So that should make the background dark, sort of bluish, a little bit sort of gray blue. So that is pretty cool. I mean, these don't look too bad, but I really want to make these a lot different. So let's try out some different things. So over here in the headline section, I'm going to set up dark mode here and change the text to yellow. And then I'll use 500. So this should be the headline will now be yellow, 500. And then we will lighten up a little bit of the text that's underneath. So again, in dark mode, we will say text gray. And we'll do 200 here just to make it a little brighter. Pretty nice. And then right besides this group, I'm going to make a dark mode and have it make the background color yellow 300 here. So that means that the cards will now have a yellow background color. And let's go ahead and change the border color as well. So we'll say dark border yellow 300. All right, I'm going to fix something that is sort of a little off with this layout. Notice that if the text isn't as long in some places, the buttons kind of stay up here. So I'm going to add a flex1 class. That's going to space things a little bit better. And it should push all these buttons to the same level, even if the text is a little bit shorter. So that looks good. I mean, still, this doesn't look very bad. So I think the text might probably need to be maybe a different color. So we'll change this headline here. And again, just say dark and start designing text. Let's see, orange. And let's try 600 here. So you have to make the text, I think, a little bit darker than you normally would. And then, of course, the body copy for this text here should be dark. And then we'll do text gray. And we'll try 700, see what that looks like. Just making the text a little bit darker right here in this section. So I think that looks pretty good to me. You can play around with this. I'd love to see anytime you try any of the different Tailwind CSS CodePens that I've made and you create something new, let me know. You can follow me on LinkedIn at linkedin.com/in/planetoftheweb and send me a link to your CodePens and we'll talk. Tailwind CSS was designed with configuration and customization in mind. So let's take a look at some of the options. To specify your configuration, you can do one of two things. The first is to create a tailwind.config.js file, and that works if you have a build process. Here's a sample of one that adds a custom color to the theme. With this file, the first thing you usually include is a content object. This lets Tailwind know which files it needs to analyze in order to generate the CSS. Here, we're looking for all the HTML and JavaScript files that are in the source folder, regardless of the subfolder they're in. It's good to know that you can find out how to customize any element in the documentation. Usually, you look for something like background color, then you find a section called Using Custom Values. It's always towards the bottom of the page. If you're using the PlayCDN, you use a tailwind.config object. I'm creating the same primary color here. Now notice that there's no content section. That makes sense because the PlayCDN is a JavaScript file that will already analyze the HTML document that calls it. Let's talk about some of the other options. There is an option called presets. This lets you add a configuration file to Tailwind. That means that you can load one or more styles using this array that you're going to use in your projects. The preset file should look like a copy of your config document. You can take a look at what that looks like by clicking on this link right here. And you can see that we have a full Tailwind config file in here, and every single one of the different elements are listed in here. So you can open up the theme and take a look at, for example, all the screens, the colors, and everything else in the Tailwind config file. Another option is to modify or set the dark mode settings in here. Typically, dark mode is available through a media query that is set by your operating system, but you can change this to apply when there is a dark class in a parent of your HTML. There's a pretty cool example in the documentation of how to support both modes and respect the OS preference using local storage. By far, the most important part of the config file is the theme section. In it, you can redefine how the theme is generated. In the theme section, you can override all the available classes. Now that's good if you want to redefine which classes get output and how they're built. You can click on this link to see the actual document that Tailwind CSS uses to build this file. You can also use the extend property to add to the available classes. The nice thing about Tailwind is that the documentation has a section at the bottom that shows you exactly how to override the particular class in the config document. Overriding is great if you want to change something about Tailwind CSS. A good example is this list of font weights. I have a hard time remembering that medium is 500 and that semi-bold is 600. So if I want to, I can change the name of these variables to be the name of the numbers. So you could just say 100 and 200 and so on and so forth. Now do remember that this is a JavaScript object, so your names are going to need to be quoted if you're using names that are not valid JavaScript variables. So for example, names with hyphens would have to be quoted. Now let's take a look at an example of this. You can see here that I've modified Tailwind config and fixed all of the theme font weights. Now in my document, instead of using medium and light and those sort of keywords, I can just use the new names. Now it is a little bit dangerous to just change the names of things, especially if you're bringing in somebody that is used to the way that the names work with Tailwind CSS. So another way that you can work with the classes is by extending them. This is great if you want to add things to the existing set of classes. You can define with this an additional element that will be added to the list of existing elements. A great example for this is adding color names. Now the cool thing is that when you add a color name, all of the classes that use colors will be available with your new names. So for example, the background colors will have a BG, and in this case we've added a single color here called beige, so you will now have a BG-beige class as well as a text-beige class. Now if you do want to include different numbers, you can add them in a sub-object right here. So here we're going to have a variable called primary, and it's going to have a btn primary 100 and 200. Now if you just put in the class of btn primary, then you will get whatever this default value is set to. So let's take a look at that in action. You can see here that I've defined the color beige, and I have different weights for the primary class, and I have this default element. Now notice that the default element and 600 are exactly the same. I did that because since I have 100 through 500, I didn't want to skip 600. So I sort of made the default be that, and then I also use the name right here. So now if you take a look at the document, we have this BG beige color available to us. And then I have things like text primary 700 available for this color right here, as well as the default color, which is text primary, which happens to be the same thing as text primary 600. Tailwind CSS also has some existing scales that are used throughout different classes. It uses those when building or customizing elements. So let's take a look at those. The popular scales are things like spacing, colors, screens, and lots more. And the way that you use them in the config file is by calling the theme itself and then referencing an object that has the original theme in it. So for example, when we want to create a padding rule, we don't have to create all the padding scale again. We just refer to from the theme the already existing spacing variable. We can also do that when we want to redefine an element. So you can see here that for ring color, I'm calling the existing theme and then using this theme as the default here, and then also adding all of the colors, because the colors is another one of the popular scales. Now you probably want to take a look at this documentation to see some of these techniques used in the project. So you can see that here for backdrop grayscale, I'm using a theme called theme grayscale, and there's lots of other places where we see similar techniques. So let's look for the spacing theme here, and you can see that flex bases using the spacing theme. And if we come up here, we can look for spacing, which is a scale that has a ton of different options. This is probably the biggest one. So it has all of these existing names and sizes. And if you look for theme, you can find all of these all over the place. So there's also another scale for opacity. So you could use this technique if you want to. However, this may not work in the Play CDN. This is something that you may only have access to if you are using the build process. But I figured it's something important that I can mention, and it might help you create some of your own custom themes as well as your own custom scales. Tailwind CSS has a plugin system that allows you to extend how it works. And there's also some built-in plugins, so let's take a look. To create or add a plugin, you add code to your config file. This is something that you can try out with either the build tool or the playground. Plugins give you full JavaScript control over how Tailwind CSS works. It can go beyond the config file by giving you a way to create and modify classes dynamically. Here's what a basic plugin looks like. It receives a single object that can be destructured into individual variables. Notice that to use it, we have to require the plugin, which means that we have to install it. So for example, you can use the add utilities parameter to register new utility classes. Now, what I'm doing here is creating a new class called huge. Whatever you create in this particular section is not going to allow people to create custom sizes. So you can't do stuff like create a huge and then put in a different font size right here. Honestly, with the new just-in-time compiler and the ability to create custom classes, I'm not sure that this is the best way to add classes to the framework, especially custom classes. Now, the JavaScript angle is a little bit more interesting because you can do a lot of things with JavaScript that you can't do by just modifying the config file. Let's take a look at what this sample plugin would do. Now for this, I'm using the Tailwind Play because it does allow you to modify the config file. Here I created a new branding class, and it has a very specific set of CSS rules right here. Now, if I go to the HTML section, you'll see that I am using this new branding tag right here, and it's made this text crazily large. So you can do things like this, but honestly, as I mentioned, I think that it's probably easier to just use the CSS files. So if you want to learn more about how to create custom plugins and all of the different options, you can go to the documentation, and there's a description of all the other methods that you have access to. There are a number of official plugins you can add to Tailwind CSS. Let's take a look at the one called the Typography plugin. To use it, you have to install it with npm into your build process. Once you do that, you can modify the config file and add it to your project. What you get with this plugin is a special class called Pros. This Pros class gives you some typographic defaults that look pretty good. It works really well for content where you don't have a lot of control over the HTML that has been auto-generated through some process. For example, this would work great with markdown content, or maybe something from a database that already has HTML in it, and you can't really go in the database and change it. A lot of blogging platforms allow users to write in Markdown, and something will auto-generate some HTML for you, which you have no control over. That's what this is for. In addition to the basic Pros class, you also get some additional modifiers to target specific colors. So in this case, it's going to give you access to modifying how different neutral colors look in Tailwind CSS, as well as modifiers for each of the breakpoints. And as you'll see in the example, each size optimizes how the typography looks at that breakpoint. There's also some additional modifiers that you can use to control how different elements inside the prose are rendered. So for example, you have a modifier for dark mode called prose dark, and then there are a number of utility modifiers for just about everything you would need that's been pre-rendered. Notice there is a prose headings for all the headings, and there are proses for each individual headings, as well as paragraphs, links, and all the kind of stuff that you would get with either Markdown or some pre-rendered code. For this example, I'm going to go to the build tool process we created all the way back in the first chapter. And what I have here is just some very basic HTML, and you'll see that I have even added a few basic classes right here, just to make sure that it is responsive and it doesn't go over a certain sort of width. So the first thing I need to do to install the Prose plugin is to do an npm install. I've already got the preview running, so I've already ran npm run dev. That's why I have the preview here on the right. So I'm going to open up a new terminal, and I'm going to run the npm install command, which is npm install -d at Tailwind CSS / typography. Now this installs the plugin. And now I need to go into my Tailwind config file. And now in the plugin section, I need to require the new plugin that I just installed. All right, so now we can go into our index.html file, and we can start by adding in this article tag. So this article tag has all the HTML, and notice the HTML is just some basic headlines with paragraphs. There are no classes inside this section right here. So I'm going to start by just adding the prose class right here. And we'll save it, and you'll see that by default, it's already giving you a pretty decent looking sort of style for all these different content types. I have a block quote and some bullet points right here. It's a little bit better than just starting from scratch. And since you don't really have control over this HTML, it might be coming from a database, this actually works pretty well. So let's add a few of the other modifiers so you can get a feel for the kind of things that you can do. What we can also do is add an LG modifier and then use prose LG to add that as a breakpoint. So now when this is bigger, when it gets to certain breakpoints, it's going to change a little bit. I don't know if you can see it quite as well in here, but notice that the sizes are changing when I get to a certain breakpoint, which is almost at the edge of what I can go to right here. So you can add breakpoints to different sizes by targeting these different breakpoints. Let's try some more. So now I'm going to say that I want to look for headline level 1. So I have one at the very top here, and I can use this as a modifier. And I'm going to say I want a margin top of 4. So notice I have to scroll down, but you notice that it added a little bit of a margin here. And I'm going to modify it again. So I'll just copy this one and then say that I want to have a margin bottom of 0, and I'll go ahead and add some more. So I'm also going to say text indigo 500, and we'll save that. And you can see how it's now a different color, and it has a little bit less of a margin at the bottom. The paragraph has also got a margin as well, so that's why there's still a little bit of margin there. And now let's try the H2. We'll do a text orange, also 500, and we'll save that. And I forgot to make this an actual modifier, so it has to have the colon in it. Cool, so now you can see that this headline level 2 has a different color. And then we can use just any of the other modifier utilities to make this look however we want to. Now, this is one of my favorite plugins when I'm using something like Markdown with my process. There's another cool plugin that will help you truncate your content after a fixed number of lines. It's called Line Clamp. Now, just like with the Prose plugin, you have to install it using npm into your build process. Then you end up modifying the config file to add it to the plugins list. Now, this one just gives you a single class called Line Clamp with a quantity. And this quantity can be from 1 to 6. You can also specify none and therefore have different breakpoints. So you can use the breakpoint modifiers to say at the small breakpoint, have just one line showing, and then at a larger breakpoint, then you can have a different number of lines showing up to 6 lines. Let's take a look at how that works. So here I have this sort of sample page that you've seen before. It just has a list of the stargazers. And here I can control how many of these lines show up. Now, in the original database, there was a lot more lines here. And so a lot of times when you get things from a database, you end up with a bunch of additional text, and not every piece of content is going to have 3 lines. And I sort of faked it. I made them have 3 lines in this case. But what if some of these had 5 lines? Then it would kind of break the layout. So I want to show you how to fix that with this awesome plugin. And what I'm doing first, of course, is installing this. So I've already got my process running. That's how come we saw a preview. So I have another terminal running right here. And I'm going to do the npm install. So that's npm install -d and then at Tailwind CSS line clamp. Let's try that. Okay, once that's done, then we can close out of here and go to the Tailwind config file. And in our plugin section, we're going to require, and then a Tailwind CSS, and use this line clamp that we just installed. All right, so once we have that, it means that we can use it in our project. So I'm going to switch over to this index.html file. And in here, what I can do is look for all the paragraphs that have a bunch of text in them. Let's go ahead and hide this sidebar here. I know they're all going to have these same classes. So in Visual Studio Code, I can select those sets right there and then just hit Command D a whole bunch. And that should be picking all the other ones. Hold on. Oh, this is actually the header section. So this is not where I'm supposed to be doing this. I'm supposed to be going down here and choosing that. And then I can see the beginning of the text for the first one here. And then when I hit Command D a bunch of times, it's going to select all those instances on the page. And then I can move my, notice that there's multiple cursors now. And I can now just add the line clamp class and then specify a number of lines. So I can say line clamp 2, and I'm going to save that. And when I come back here, notice that there are only 2 lines now, and we have these 3 dots. And that's all there is to that. Very, very useful, and you can control them with breakpoints like you can just about everything else. I think that what makes Tailwind CSS really powerful are all the modifiers that you can use to modify existing classes. Hypercolor. This is just a set of gradients for Tailwind CSS, and it's pretty easy to use. Once you find a gradient that you want to use in your project, you can simply go to this Tailwind icon and click right here to copy it. You can also modify the gradient slightly by changing the direction with these buttons down here. In a similar way, you can go to this website for a set of buttons that have been pre-styled for you. There's a ton of them right here. And all you have to do is copy the code with this button underneath. There's another site called Tailblocks, which shows you the code for doing different kinds of layout. All you do is you go to the page, and if you like one of these styles, then all you have to do is click on View Code to take a look at the code for that module. Now, Tailkit is a little bit more involved, and to take full advantage, you do have to do an installation. But once you do that, it gives you the ability to get into a lot of different components that have been pre-built for you. So things like navigation, and you could see that for some of these, you're going to need some JavaScript, but you can copy the code for this navigation right here. If you're used to something like Bootstrap, you may want to take a look at Daisy UI. This is more like a Bootstrap library that is based on Tailwind CSS. So you can see the different components here, and these will have classes that you can access much like you do in Bootstrap. The creators of Tailwind CSS also sell their own component utility called Tailwind UI, which you can find on their website. It's a good way to support the development of the framework. You can see a lot of different sections that once you have access to the site will also allow you to copy the code.